President Biden has said he doesn't want to deploy the National Guard to U.S. campuses where students have been protesting Israel's war in Gaza and the resulting humanitarian crisis there. Biden said demonstrators have the right to peacefully protest, but not to cause chaos. Crews have been cleaning up at UCLA hours after police removed barricades and began dismantling a pro-Palestinian camp in the early hours of Thursday morning. Officers arrested dozens of demonstrators in the pre-dawn raid after protesters defied orders to leave. Let's get across to DW's William Glucroft for more on this story. William, we've seen police shut down several campus protests across the United States. Can you please give us an update on where things stand at this point? Does it feel like these protests have peaked, or do you expect that we'll be seeing more of them in the days and weeks to come?
We're seeing really a whack-a-mole, Claire. Like, police go into one place, shut something down, protesters pop up another place. It's really quite a typical kind of police action protest cycle that we see in many incidents like this. The thing is, though, is a matter of timing. It's a simple matter of timeline. We're in May now. University semesters, university calendar years are coming to an end. There will be final exams. There will be commencement events, and then students will go home for the summer. So the question is, do these continue into the summer as kids go back home all around the country and really all around the world and take these protests into the street, as we've already seen street protests against Israel's actions in Gaza? Or do they fizzle out? Or do they come back in the fall when school is back in session? These are, and of course the fall dovetailing with the presidential election, these are all big open questions. But at least for now, with the semester coming to a close, we might start to see these protests peter out, at least in the short run.
Now, many are drawing comparisons between these protests and the major student protests in the United States that we saw in the late 1960s. Where would you situate these in relation?
There's a lot of similarities. There's also a few key differences. I was speaking to an American professor based in Boston just last night who's seen his share of protests over the decades and in fact teaches a lot about the history of protest in the U.S., especially when it comes to the anti-war movement in Vietnam and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, as you referenced. There were major, massive campus protests against the war and for civil rights back in the 1960s that led to major political divisions. And we're seeing a lot of these parallels today. The big difference, though, is even back then, there was a corresponding strong establishment political response to what students and people on campuses were saying about ending the war in Vietnam and giving more rights to Black Americans. And now you don't see that. Both Republicans, especially Republicans, but also Democrats, are not really speaking up in favor of these protesters. Yes, generally right to free speech, but no one, as we heard, Biden is not saying he's going to change his policies in any way, shape, or form.
And Biden has, as you've alluded to, finally broken his silence on these, saying that these protests across the country have not changed his position toward the region. But you've mentioned also U.S. elections coming up in November. What kind of political effect have these protests had?
Well, we talked about the 1960s. We can also talk about 2020, where the summer leading into the fall elections was Black Lives Matter movement, where there were protests all around the country, an incredibly tense time in the U.S., and had an impact on the election result between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Maybe gave Joe Biden a bit of an edge as Democrats stood up for the Black Lives Matter movement, even going as far as sometimes saying defund the police. Well, 4 years later, a lot of those same Democrats are in favor of the police going in and breaking up these protests that they're seeing in favor of Palestinians and Palestinian rights, obviously not in the U.S., but in Gaza as it relates to Israel. Joe Biden's playing a dangerous game. He needs the young vote. And young people are really turned off especially by Biden's positioning and the incredible crackdown. And many young people are saying, well, if this is what we have, if this is the kind of situation we have in terms of protests, in terms of free speech under a Biden and Democratic kind of administration, does it really matter if Donald Trump is president? This is the calculus that a lot of voters are going to be thinking about going into the fall. It's not a matter of whether they'll vote for Donald Trump. They might just not vote at all. And that could be enough to tip the balance away from Joe Biden and towards Donald Trump. That's the risk that he and Democrats, Joe Biden and Democrats, are facing.
William, thank you. That is DW's William Glucroft.